everyone. I'm going to be going over the final round speech structure today, and it's going to be a little bit different than we've done in the past and a little bit more specific, and just going over how to put your speech together. So we're going to go over how to go into the introduction, the statement of the plan benefits, and conclusion, and then leave you off with some general pointers for the speech. So let's start off with the introduction. And the purpose of the introduction is to get the audience interested and kind of lay out some background information for them that they would need to understand the rest of your speech. So remember, this speech, you will be picking a plan, and then under the resolution, we've given you some options, which Riya will go over in the next video, and you could choose your own. So basically, in the introduction, you want a hook, so an opening line that is kind of an attention getter. So this could be kind of an interesting fact or example that's related to your problem, or just generally about criminal justice, what our stats are, things like that. Something that could surprise or draw in the audience, and then some background information. So this would be explaining important definitions, maybe related to the plan, and just information that might be necessary to be able to understand the rest of your benefits and plan. And the next part of the speech is the plan statement. So this is where you're clearly kind of indicating what your plan is and outlining where you're going to go on the rest of the speech. So what the benefits of those plans are, basically. And this is kind of like the thesis statement or the main argument. So you want to make that really clear. And that will go at the end of your introduction and before you go in and really explain the meat and the body of your benefits. An example structure for this could be something like, I believe the United States federal government should enact the Reverse Mass Incarceration Act, or there's many other new types of plans in the options that we give you. So I really encourage you to look at those. And because blank, blank, blank benefits. You don't have to say the word benefits, but improves this, lowers this, blah, blah, blah. You can make that all in one. You could choose to maybe make it 2 sentences, like I believe just one plan statement and then the benefits in the next sentence. But either way, you want to just isolate that. And it should be clear to the audience when you're going to this part. Next is kind of just the main body of the speech. And this is where you really get into what the benefit of the plans are. And you want to convince the audience basically that your plan is a good idea. So you want to use different types of evidence to support your plan, and that's where you do this. For each benefit, you want probably 3 or 2 really big ones. And for each one, you want a topic sentence. So this is like a statement of the benefit and why it's important. And so you just want to explain the implications of that or reasons that people should care about it. Supporting evidence. So when you're using supporting evidence, you don't want to use huge chunks of evidence like we do in debate. Rather, you want to paraphrase what their argument is if it's really long, or you want to pull some short quotes. Or when we really think about looking at the warrants in debate, maybe you want to pull out the reasons the author says that the argument is true and paraphrase those. So this is how you want to kind of pull in evidence and then relate it back to and kind of connect it to your benefit that you're talking about. And then lastly, for your conclusion sentence, I would recommend tying it back to your thesis and your plan statement and explaining why your plan is really effective at solving those, and kind of summarize how your plan solves the problem that you have just explained in the benefit. Lastly is the conclusion. So this should summarize your benefits and kind of draw out and look at larger themes. So basically the 2 steps here are literally what is in the purpose of it. It's to reiterate the plan benefits and then just a general explanation of why those benefits are important for the world and people should care about them. So this is a larger level kind of thing than you have done before. And you could connect this to stuff that you said in your introduction. In your introduction, you probably gave some background information and why this is important, connected back to that and be like, now you know that what I was saying is true. And then lastly, if you, throughout your body paragraphs, one more thing and one other persuasive technique, which I'm about to go over, is answering the other side's argument. So slipping in a sentence or two about some people may say this, but we say this is really good. So you would want some of that in the body paragraphs actually. And then in the conclusion, you can, you know how you do impact calc and debate, you could do a similar type of sentence, which is like, so even though there might be some drawbacks because of this, we have said that these reasons are blah, blah, blah important, and this is why you should prefer it. So that is something that could be really powerful, I think, in the conclusion, and a way to kind of connect it all for the audience. Lastly, there's just some general tips for the speech, which we have seen after judging and everything that people could work on. One thing is that presentation really matters. So eye contact, varying your pace, and really slowing down and pausing at important moments. Maybe if you're telling like kind of emotional story or example, like you would want to pause and go a little bit slower. And or if you're giving your thesis, because that's very important. So it's not totally like debate because the speaking style and your organization and just the way you explain things is like a little bit different, like especially like evidence, for example, how you pull that in. You're going to wrap it into your own essay a little bit more than you would in like a constructive debate speech where you're reading a bunch of evidence. And assume your audience knows very little about the plan. Like we've been talking about this for maybe a couple tournaments. So maybe you have some more familiarity. We've given like a couple of speeches on it already, but assume they like all of that didn't happen, and you have to explain kind of in the background information and throughout your evidence, like connect it back to the plan and really make sure that you're explaining everything thoroughly. Full citations. So this means including the source, the year, and the author. And what I mean by source is it from Brookings Institution? Is it from what magazine is it from? Is it from Forbes magazine? So just explain the source of the article, the year, which you should have. And then sometimes they leave off an author, but most of the times they will have an author. So include that as well. And then vary your persuasive techniques. So this is just like what type of evidence you bring in, how you persuade the reader or the audience rather. You would want to change that up a little bit. So logos, these are kind of three ways. These are logos, pathos, and ethos are kind of three types of persuasive techniques. And logos is logical argumentation. So this would be kind of statistics, facts, traditional kind of reasoning, like because this, we should think this. Like that is kind of just traditional logical reasoning. That would all fall under logos. And debaters traditionally like think of this as the most valid type of evidence or whatever, but this is just one type of persuasive technique. Another thing is pathos. So this is the emotional stuff. Maybe you're telling a story about an individual in an example. You're invoking empathy from the audience. You're like, put yourself in this situation. How would you feel? Those type of things would fall under pathos. And then ethos is building up your credibility as a speaker. So maybe this would be your citations. If you're citing important people and explaining where they come from, you become more credible because you know that your information is coming from a good source. And answering another side's argument is also very important when you're building ethos, because now you're really making your argument more convincing because you acknowledge that, yes, there are arguments on the other side, but still our reasons are more important. So yeah, those are just the general pointers to leave you off with and how you should structure your speech.
Okay, so next we're going to have Riya, who is going to talk about some of the information that you can plug into the format and the structure that Sukriti talked about. So Riya, whenever you're ready.
All right. So like Clay said, now you know how to write your speech, or the structure you're supposed to use when you're writing your speech, but what exactly do you put in it once you have that structure? So that's what we're going to talk about, sort of more content heavy things, what kind of things you should be looking for when we're talking about evidence. So first, at a very basic level, what exactly do we mean when we talk about evidence? What's good evidence that you should be putting in your speeches? So generally, you want to be looking at things like statistics, published studies. Sometimes you'll see people using anecdotes, although these tend to be less effective since they're much more narrow in scope. But because Speech Bowl is different than debate in that you kind of have to mine through articles articles that you've already been given and pick out each of these three types of things for yourselves, it's important to know what exactly you should be binding out, which specific pieces you should be taking, especially if you decide to pursue your own topic. But just keep that in mind when you're looking through the articles that you were given for your prep as part of your prep materials. These are the kinds of things you should be looking for that are typically very persuasive types of evidence. So there's 5 plans that you can choose from. So basically 5 topics that you can choose to focus on when you're doing your Speech Bowl speech. We're going to go through each of those one by one and kind of go through a general overview of what each of these plans mean. So the first plan is the United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform in the United States by divestment of policing in the United States. So before we talk about that, what that means, on the right side, you can see the 2 citations. These are just resources you can rely on when you're thinking about, all right, how do I support my plan? What exactly should I be using? So what exactly does this plan mean? So you might have heard this term a lot, especially in the recent months and over the summer, but defunding the police, that's essentially what this plan is focusing on. When they say divestment of policing in the United States, that's basically what they mean. That basically means moving funds from the police department and shifting those to non-policing efforts. So lots of times that'll mean taking away some money from the police and moving that to another department like housing or education or employment or maybe mental health services or schools or things like that. A lot of sort of community building type programs. So it's basically taking money from one place and moving it to another. That's basically what we're talking about when we say defunding the police. And that's essentially what you're trying to support with this program. You're saying that we should limit or we should enact substantial criminal justice reform by limiting police resources, by defunding the police and shifting those resources other places. So next step, if you decide to go with this plan, is to look at those resources and say, all right, like, what do we want from this? What can I take from these articles that'll help me support the idea that we should be defunding the police? So when you're reading those articles and you're looking to see what kind of evidence should we be including, there's a couple things you want to keep in mind. So first, you might want to answer the question of how effective would this be? Are there other places that have done it already that have defunded their police departments and it's worked? Things like that. But I've included a couple of examples of things of pieces of evidence that you might want to use if you decide to pursue this plan, or examples of what might be considered persuasive evidence if you were to go with plan number 1. So first thing is, this is a screenshot from one of the articles that you were provided with if you decide to go with plan number 1. So here you can see this is an example of one police department in Camden City that did defund their own department and redirected those resources, redirected their funding to other places. And then as a result, crime rates dropped murder rates dropped by 70%, violent crimes by 40%, which is pretty persuasive. It's also an example of really strong evidence. You have a statistic and also, an example of this happening in another place where it did work. So all of those things are, facts that would help support your plan if you do decide to do this first one. So that's sort of an example of what we're looking at when we think about, all right, why should we be defunding the police? Here's an example. All right, so plan number 2. So we talked about defunding the police. What if you want to go with another plan? This is the second one you can choose from. So essentially, the United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform of stop, question, and frisk policing practices in the United States. Again, on the right side, here are your resources that you can use should you decide to go with this plan. But what does this plan mean? So this is another term you might have heard a lot, but maybe didn't understand as much, but it's basically focusing on a policy called stop and frisk. So what is stop and frisk? This is essentially a policy or like a rule that allows police officers to detain or question or sometimes search civilians for weapons. So you can sort of think of it like this. Say I am, a normal person walking around in New York, I'm walking around the street one day, this rule basically says that if a police officer thinks that I might be carrying a weapon or might, have something that could harm someone else, then they are able to stop me on the street and then search me or stop me and question me, any of those things, because this rule is in place. So why might this be a problem? There's two ways that you can think of it as being a problematic policy. So the first one is, think about who is getting stopped. If we think about the example, like a police officer sees someone on the street, how do they decide, of all the people that are on the street, who do they stop? There's a lot of issues that can happen with that. And what you'll see is that a lot of times minorities end up getting targeted. They end up getting stopped a lot more often than other people, because there's no real mechanism by which police officers decide to stop people. So there's a lot of profiling that tends to happen because of that. Another big issue that you see with this policy is relating to how these people are actually being stopped. So this relates to use of force. So what I mean when I say that is, sometimes when a police officer stops someone, it won't necessarily be like, them tapping you on the shoulder and saying like, hey buddy, can I ask you a couple questions? Sometimes those interactions can become really violent, and police officers can use higher than justified amounts of force, which can result in a lot of the instances that we saw against minorities over the summer. But that's another really big problem with this policy, that it can not only result in people being targeted unfairly because of their race, but also when they are targeted, it can become really violent, and they can be really forcefully stopped, and that leads to more violence. So those are all reasons that we have this, that one of the plan, that this plan is an option. You might want to support stopping that policy or ending that policy, in which case you would go with plan number 2 and look at those resources. So another example I took here, like I said, when you're thinking about this question, who's getting stopped, you'll see this is a screenshot from one of the pieces of evidence that you were given, one of the sources that I put on the other slide. But here you can see that despite only like a really small proportion of people being, this is New York, by the way, when they say city, despite a really, really small proportion of people being Black and Latino, a significantly larger proportion of them are actually being stopped, even though they're not actually, a large number of people in the city. So that's really problematic. And it shows how there might be some instances of profiling when you have this policy. So those are all things that you want to keep in mind when you're thinking about this topic, when you're thinking about what evidence might I want to focus on, why might this policy be problematic. Those are things that you will definitely want to keep in mind if you decide to go with plan number 2. So our next plan is plan number 3. So this plan essentially says that the United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform in the United States by ending the 1033 program. And there are your resources again. All right. So what is the 1033 program? This one is definitely, I think, not as talked about as much as you might hear stop and frisk or defunding the police, but it is very, very important. So this is essentially a program that allows extra military equipment to be transferred to, smaller police departments across the country. So when we say surplus military equipment or excess military equipment, what exactly are we talking about there? So those include things like military grade weapons, armored vehicles, rifles, aircrafts. The reason that might be a problem is because these are really dangerous weapons and really powerful weapons, and when they're that leads to a lot of these problems when you have police officers, especially over the summer. You might have seen instances where there's excessive force being used by police officers. A lot of that happens because they have access to these really dangerous weapons that shouldn't necessarily be in a police department, that only belong in the military. So this plan essentially says, we want to end this program. We no longer want police officers to have access to things like military grade weapons, armored vehicles, rifles, aircrafts, because when they use those things or when they have access to those things, it can lead to problems like excessive use of force, or it can lead to problems like sometimes you might have seen uses of force like that at some of the protests we saw over the summer, where these specific items are being used because this program allows police departments to have those specific items. So if you decide to go with plan number 3, you will basically be saying, we don't want police departments to have access to any of those military level weapons anymore. And then, what you might put in your speech is what kind of problems are created because they have access to those weapons, things like that. Are things that you might want to focus on. Okay, so plan number 4. So this plan says that the United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice within the United States reform. Oh, whoops, sorry. That was a typo on my part. Basically, enact substantial criminal justice in the area of policing by defunding immigration and customs enforcement. And then there are your resources again. So this is another thing that you would have heard a lot in the news, especially earlier on in the Trump administration. You might have heard the phrase abolish ICE. It was like a big hashtag abolish ICE. It's something that was on social media a lot, especially 2 or 3 years ago. But basically, we'll start with what is ICE? What do they do? Who are they? ICE stands for Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. This is basically like a branch of the government that focuses on immigration and also sort of like regulating those processes. They're responsible for deportation, things like that. So a big reason that people want this agency, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, to be abolished is because it can be summed up in one word, sort of, excess. Sometimes you might have seen a lot in the news lately, mass detentions of especially children being separated from their families as well, like mass detentions at the border, really high deportation rates. But a really big reason people want ICE to be abolished, this agency to be abolished, is because arrests of people who are now naturalized citizens, meaning they have now become citizens of the United States, but they once were not. So they came here and then they became a citizen. Arrests of those people have increased a lot for a lot of the reasons that you might see in stop and frisk, a lot of profiling, but reasons like that. And there have been lots of cases where those people have then actually been deported unjustly. And so there's sort of like a lot of issues with that, a lot of issues with too many people being detained at once, and a lot of inhumane, like human rights, unjust practices going on, especially at the border. So for all those reasons, people say we should end this. We don't need this government agency anymore. It's not justified having it anymore for human rights reasons, for spending too much and leading to too high arrests that are not justified. Basically, for those reasons, there's no reason to have this agency. And so it would be more beneficial for the criminal justice system to abolish ICE and end it now. So that is the 4th plan if you decide to go that route. The final plan is whatever you want it to be. If you feel that there is another reason that is not related to, or if you feel that there's another way to improve the criminal justice system that is not related to stop and frisk or defunding the police or abolishing ICE or ending the 1033 program, if you think that, I think that there's, something else that maybe wasn't included that could actually be a lot stronger, then you can feel free to do that if you choose to go with plan 5. And then the only thing though is that if you do decide to go with plan 5, you're responsible for finding your own resources and your own evidence. But if you do think that there's another option that you might want to go for, then you can feel free to go with the 5th plan out of the 5.